Ebola is a very, very small thing known as a virus. It's made of a bit of RNA or DNA and a few proteins and a hull. It has no ability to do anything whatsoever by itself and can only survive and proliferate by infecting cells. To avoid this, we have the immune system. Typically, dendritic cells will activate the army of helper T cells and killer T cells, along with B lymphocytes, to wipe out the infection in a matter of days. But when Ebola strikes, it directly attacks the immune system. Some of the first cells it takes over are the dendritic cells, the brains of the immune system. The Ebola virus enters a dendritic cell by binding its interoceptors for cell transport. Once inside, it dissolves its outer hull and releases its genetic material, nucleoproteins, and enzymes. Once the cell is taken over, it uses it to produce and replicate other Ebola viruses. Once completely saturated, it dissolves the membrane and releases millions of viruses into the tissue. The virus not only prevents the dendritic cells from activating the specialized and antivirus forces, it manipulates them into sending signal proteins that tricks specialized cells into ending their own lives prematurely. So the immune system is seriously disrupted and unable to react. When the virus rapidly proliferates, there are cells that should deal with the infected cells, natural killer cells, but they also get infected and die before they can prevent the virus from spreading. At the same time, Ebola affects the guard cells of the body, the macrophages and monocytes, not only managing to outsmart their defenses, but also manipulating some to send signals to the cells that make up the blood vessels, telling it to release fluid into the body. Usually this makes sense, but in this case it just causes mayhem. All the body's neutrophils are awakened. They are not very effective against viruses and should not be involved in this fight. They begin to do lots of things they shouldn't do. The neutrophil signals to the blood vessels to release more fluid, causing internal bleeding. The Ebola virus also attacks organs such as the liver. The Ebola virus finds it very easy to penetrate into the liver and begins to proliferate inside it, killing many liver cells. Once completely saturated, this causes organ failure and more internal bleeding. All the mechanisms that the immune system has evolved to help fight infection begin to work against you, and the virus continues to spread and finally begins to infect more body cells. In a desperate last effort to turn the tide, the immune system launches a cytokine storm. A cytokine storm is an SOS signal that causes the immune system to launch all of its weapons all at once in a desperate attack. This hurts the virus but leaves behind tons of collateral damage. Paradoxically, the healthier the immune system, the more damage it can do to itself. More and more fluid leaves the bloodstream. Blood pours out of every opening, and you become seriously dehydrated. There's just not enough blood left to supply the organs with the oxygen they require, and cells begin to die. When delving into the factors that caused the 2014 West African outbreak of Ebola, it is important to note the social and scientific factors. In a social context, this outbreak was an old disease in a new context. All previous outbreaks had occurred in equatorial Africa. This meant that West Africa, who had never experienced an Ebola outbreak, were poorly prepared for this unfamiliar and unexpected disease at every level, from early detection of the first cases to orchestrating an appropriate response. The West African outbreaks demonstrated how swiftly the virus could move once it reached an urban setting and densely populated slums. Lastly, the lack of education amongst the population and the limited amount of doctors played a vital role in Ebola becoming an epidemic. The fear and misperceptions about an unfamiliar disease within the population halted control efforts in all three countries. People and their ancestors had been living in the same ecological environment for centuries, hunting the same wild animals in the same forest areas, and had never before seen a disease like Ebola. Equally unfamiliar were the response measures like disinfecting houses, setting up barriers and fever checks, and the invasion by foreigners dressed in what looked like spacesuits, who took people to hospitals or barricaded tent-like wards from which few returned. Overall, Ebola is a highly virulent disease. However, several factors can maintain its contagiousness. Thus, it was the poor management and control of this disease that led to the outbreak of West Africa in 2014. While there is no current vaccine for the Ebola virus, a serum was developed that allows you to acquire a kind of temporary passive immunity artificially by receiving exogenous antibodies from the plasma of an immune donor. A serum was made from the blood plasma of other medical workers who had been infected and survived. The antibodies help defend the patients from the virus before their own active immunity could identify that particular antigen and start creating their own antibodies. Since antibodies can't actually do the killing themselves, they have a few strategies that make it harder for antibodies to take hold. One of the most effective strategies is neutralization. where antibodies physically block the binding sites on viruses or bacterial toxins so they can't hook onto your tissues. And because antibodies have more than one binding site, they can bind to multiple antigens at the same time in a process called agglutination. The resulting clumps can't get around easily, which makes it easier for macrophages to destroy them. And not only that, but while all this is going on, antibodies are also sending chemical signals called cytokines, calling in phagocytes from the innate immune system and special lymphocytes from the adaptive system to destroy these antigen antibody clumps. It's not the same as a vaccine, which uses weakened or dead pathogens to evoke a faster and stronger secondary response, which immediately engages your B cells, but it can buy a patient crucial time against the infection, which would otherwise quickly kill. Vaccination is an effective procedure to stop the spread of disease within a population by providing the population with immunity. The effectiveness of this procedure is furthered with the concept of herd immunity, meaning that the more people within a population that are vaccinated or immune, the less likely the population is to suffer from an epidemic or an outbreak of disease. The effectiveness of the vaccination procedure is shown in this model, as Ebola does not have a vaccination, and thus the spread of disease is more prevalent.